Hello, this is a literary provocation. It builds on my interest in the ways in which travel writing can, despite the often colonial roots of the form, serve as a space where, to borrow terms from Ether, people of conflicting worldviews, memories and future visions can encounter each other. I'm going to take an early 20th century example, but explore through this questions of more general translatability. Following his premature death at the age of 41, the man you see here, the Breton, doctor, traveller, author and theorist of the exotic Victor Segalen, largely disappeared from public attention. He was a victim of what a number of critics have seen as the radical untimeliness of his literary and theoretical work. What's striking, though, is the way in which Segalen's visibility slowly yet progressively increased as it was discovered by generations of readers across the second half of the 20th century. This was a process triggered not least by the influential critical engagements with his writings in the post-war period by key post-colonial intellectuals, such as the Martinican Edouard Glissant, whose thinking I know is central to the Ether network, and also the Moroccan Abdelkebir Khatibi. Much of Segalen's work appeared, and indeed continues to appear, posthumously. At the time of his death, he had published only 3 books. A poorly received ethnographic novel, in which he attempted to recount the fatal impact of European colonization in Polynesia from an indigenous perspective. That was called Les Immémoriaux. It's translated as A Lapse of Memory. You can see that here. He also published an elaborately presented series of prose poems. You can see that on the right here, inspired by the form of Chinese funerary monuments called stele, or stelae in English. And then there was a further volume of prose poems, you can see it in the middle, also inspired by Chinese visual culture, called peinture, or paintings. All of these works sketch out what the author calls an aesthetics of diversity. They were written during a period when colonial literature and the exoticist novel were at their height. They attempt, though, to produce a narrative perspective that either recreates non-Western voices, or is at least inflected or attenuated by the multiple perspectives that constitute any form of interhuman and intercultural encounter. The aim of this provocation is to explore the ambiguities of Segalen's engagement with the ethics of travel, and by extension to reflect on the ways in which travel narratives can present contact zones as spaces that highlight the initial discomforts that encounters with difference are likely to produce. I'm going to suggest in the process the extent to which such early 20th century literary experimentation may be related in creative terms to contemporary reflections on concepts such as Spivak's teleopoiesis, a comparative reading practice that depends on, and I quote Spivak, imagining yourself, really letting yourself be imagined, experience that possibility without guarantees by and in another culture. What was original in Segalen's work, produced in a context characterized by the still often unquestioned assumptions of colonial expansion, was its reflection on the relationship between Western self and non-Western other. In the field of travel, to borrow the terminology of Mary Louise Pratt in the context of her thinking on the contact zone, this translates into a reflection on the connection between traveller and travelee. Central to Segalen's innovation here was this text here, a 1907 text I've already mentioned, Les Immémoriaux, A Lapse of Memory, republished in 1956. You can see that version on the right, alongside other key contemporary texts like Claude Lévi-Strauss's Triste Tropique, but also Aimé Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism. So, in a period of decolonization, this narrative of the European colonization and religious conversion of Tahiti, a work that had been largely met with incomprehension half a century earlier, found at last a receptive audience. New readers in the mid-20th century engaged with debates about the destructive force of colonial expansion in its many forms. They also began to appreciate a text in which the articulation of subaltern subjectivity and the inverse exoticism this has permitted were not mere literary conceits, but had serious implications for a critique of the New World Order that was becoming rapidly apparent through the struggle for independence in sub-Saharan Africa and Algeria. I think it's Segalen's precursory status that is perhaps important here. And I'm going to suggest in this provocation that his work may be seen to outline a premature, in many ways, contribution to ethical criticism to readings of travel literature. Segalen's own travelogues, and most notably the text you see here, Équipé, translated a couple of years ago into English as Journey to the Land of the Real, pose in their representation of interpersonal encounters in the field between Western travellers and often Chinese travelees. They pose clear questions about the ethics of travel, and in particular about the asymmetries of power that such meetings often imply. He presents these encounters in terms of a mutually disorientating destabilization of identity. This is dependent on an understanding of exoticism that is profoundly bilateral and depends ultimately on an imagination of mutual defamiliarization. According to this, the traditional solipsism of the European traveller is undermined. And this goes on to challenge a critical orthodoxy in the Anglophone Academy, where the founding and enduring influence of critics such as Edward Said and Mary Louise Pratt has often meant that travel literature has been read as a form of colonial discourse. What interests me in this provocation is the way since the late 1990s, a number of travel scholars have sought a way out of that particular impasse. So I'm thinking of Graham Huggan, Syed Islam, Debbie Lyle, all of whom have suggested a clear attenuation of any previous assumption that the travel narrative was automatically and unswervingly conscripted to projects of colonial expansionism. Central to these is the question as to whether travel narratives have become less culturally arrogant, or at least less ideologically complicit with established patterns of colonial representation. By extension, I think it's become increasingly possible to consider the ways in which travelogues, far from being inherently conservative, have historically been deployed to elaborate or support oppositional stances or even political radicalism. Now, a number of these urgent questions are associated directly with an issue central to Segalen's early 20th century reflections on travel and the intercultural encounters it permits. And I'm thinking in particular about what I've mentioned already, that's the relationship between the traveller and the travelee. In the work of Edward Said, the former, that is the traveller, through the hallucination or abstract imagination of elsewhere, is said to proceed solipsistically, denying the existence of the latter, that is, the travelee, or at least reducing the travelee to a lifeless trope. By coining this term travelee, Mary Louise Pratt, I think, engaged in those very polarized debates. She attempted to reanimate this passive character who, in her terms, is often travelled over, seeing the traveller and travellee as coexisting and acknowledging what she sees as traces of their co-presence. And I think the contact zone that interests us is an attempt to invoke the spatial and temporal co-presence of subjects, previously separated, she suggests, by geographic and historical disjunctures, whose trajectories now in the field of travel intersect. This sort of contact perspective emphasizes how subjects are constituted in and by their relationships to each other. It treats the relations, for example, among colonizers and colonized, among travelers and travelees, not, and again I turn to Pratt, in terms of separateness, but rather of this co-presence, of interaction, of interlocking understandings and practices, often though, and clearly it's essential to underline this, within radically asymmetrical relations of power. Instead of the subaltern being denied speech and the critic confirming this denial by seeking evidence of silence, Pratt encouraged a more sensitive approach to traces of otherness in the travel narrative, and in particular to textual traces of the ways in which Western culture might be seen to have been transculturated, that is, reprocessed and represented in various ways by the inhabitants of the so-called periphery to which these travellers journey. Although Pratt imagines a contact zone in which co-presence leads to interaction, she says, interlocking understandings and practices, I think it's probably only more recently, particularly in the post-war period, that this potential instability of the traveller's identity has become really apparent. And this is particularly striking in the work of travellers such as Nicolas Bouvier, a Swiss author, who, in a text such as the one you see here, the scorpion fish, writes according to what some have seen as an aesthetics of disappearance. So the traveller progressively erases themselves from the account in the face of their experience of other cultures. In conclusion, I'm going to suggest a rereading then of this travelogue by Ségolène Équipée, published for the first time in 1929. Unlike many other travel writers and colonial authors of the period, there's a tendency throughout Ségolène's work to acknowledge the travelling or mobile nature of other cultures. So the Polynesian or Chinese protagonists of some of his most important works are themselves travellers. And this understanding of the travelling nature of other cultures and of the potential of their inhabitants to be travellers in their own right is radically different from that of the majority of his contemporaries. These ideas are translated via the travelogue Équipée into a reflection on the traveller-narrator's relationship to, and his representation of, the travellees he meets. For instance, and I'll give you this example in a moment, a Chinese girl who stares at the French traveller produces a troubling moment of contact as the narrator is himself exoticized and, in Pratt's terms, you can see them here, studied from the perspective of those who participate on the receiving end of travel. In the episode I'm thinking of, and you can see the text here, what Ségolène describes as the astonishing spectacle of two other eyes looking back is a glimpsed moment in the contact zone, a moment of, to cite Pratt again, co-presence, interaction, interlocking understandings and practices, often within radically asymmetrical relations of power. The aristocratic, even romantic stances of Ségolène's early 20th century traveller are undeniably connected with the cultural and ethnic hierarchies that underpin the accounts of many contemporary colonial journeys. But what I see is these stances at the same time being challenged by a latent awareness of the ways in which the travelling self might no longer be sovereign and all-seeing, but is instead relativized, destabilized, and exoticized. I finish with James Clifford, who described all of this in The Predicament of Culture. He says, Ségolène writes the modern experience of displacement, self and other, a sequence of encounters, detours, with the stable identity of each at issue. What emerges from Ségolène's work is a different understanding of encounters in the contact zone, something that is, again to quote Clifford, more troubling, much less stable. Thank you very much for following this provocation. I look forward to discussing it in due course.